The day had started just like any other for the quiet young woman who worked at the small cafe near the busy town square. She came in early, as she always did, tying her apron carefully and greeting everyone with a small, polite smile. She never spoke much, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't think anyone really cared to listen. The cafe was always noisy, filled with people talking over each other, music playing on the speakers, and cups clinking, but she moved through it like a gentle breeze present. But unnoticed, in one corner of the cafe stood an old piano. Most people didn't even look at it anymore. It was dusty, slightly out of tune, and more of a decoration than an actual instrument, but she always noticed it. Every morning, when she walked past it to get to the counter, she would run her fingers lightly across the wooden edge. She never played it, never talked about it, but something inside her always paused when she saw it. Her co-workers were louder, more energetic, and always joking around. They liked to tease her, not out of real hate, but because her quietness made her an easy target for silly comments. They didn't understand her silence, and instead of asking, they simply assumed she was shy or strange. She never complained, never defended herself. She just continued working, hoping every day would pass without any trouble. That afternoon, the cafe was packed. A group of university students sat near the piano laughing loudly about something on their phones. Her co-worker, a young man who enjoyed being the center of attention, was trying extra hard to impress them. He told jokes, exaggerated stories, and even tried singing loudly to make them laugh. They laughed at everything he said, feeding his confidence. She kept wiping tables nearby, trying not to be noticed. But the students soon started talking about the piano. One of them said something like, "I bet no one here even knows how to play this old thing." Another joked, "Maybe we should challenge someone." Her co-worker immediately jumped at the chance to extend the conversation. "Oh, someone here can play," he said loudly. She froze for a second, confused. He couldn't possibly mean her. She had never told anyone about her connection to music. She had never touched the cafe piano. No one here knew anything about her past. But before she could look away, he pointed straight at her and said, "She can play. She's always touching the piano when she walks by. I bet she knows how to play." The students turned toward her, curious now. She felt her heart drop. Her palms began to sweat, and she tried to give a small smile as if to say no. But her coworker continued, "Come on, show them. Don't be shy. Play something." She politely shook her head. "I can't," she said softly, but her coworker waved off her refusal. "Of course you can. Don't pretend. If you're scared, just say so." The students laughed at his tone not because they hated her, but because they thought it was part of a harmless joke. They didn't understand how she felt. Their laughter was light, but to her it felt heavy. The sound pushed against her chest like a weight. She repeated again, "I really can't." But the teasing didn't stop. A few customers nearby turned to look, sensing something happening. Her face grew warm from embarrassment. She hated attention, especially this kind. Her coworker rolled his eyes and said in a loud voice, "Seriously, all that time touching the piano like you're some artist, and now you're acting like you don't know anything." She swallowed hard. She had never once pretended to be anything. She only touched the piano because it reminded her of something she didn't talk about her, part of her life that felt like it belonged to another time. One of the students, trying to be friendly but completely misunderstanding the situation, clapped and said, "Come on, just one song. We want to hear you." She looked around. Everyone was staring now. The noise of the cafe had quietened so much that even the coffee machine sounded louder than usual. Her breathing felt uneven. She didn't want to be rude. She didn't want to create a scene. She just didn't want to do this. But with every second she delayed, more eyes turned toward her. Some were curious, some amused, and some simply wanted entertainment on a slow afternoon. Her coworker folded his arms and smirked. "If you don't want to, fine. Just admit you can't do it." That sentence was what finally pushed her into a corner, not because she cared what he thought, but because she didn't want to be labeled as someone pretending to be something she wasn't. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted this, but now she was trapped between saying no again or letting the teasing get worse. A small voice inside her whispered, "Just play a little, then it will be over." Her hands were shaking when she took off her apron. The room felt too bright, too silent, too expectant. Every step she took toward the piano felt like stepping deeper into a spotlight she never wanted. When she reached the piano bench, she hesitated. She wanted to back out. She wanted to say she couldn't, but everyone was watching. She sat down slowly, her knees weak. The piano felt cold under her fingertips. She pressed a single key lightly, just to feel something familiar. The sound was slightly off, not perfect, but still recognizable. The students waited. Her coworker leaned against a table with a proud grin, as if he had accomplished something. But she didn't look at any of them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys. In that moment, something inside her cracked open memories she had tried to bury. She hadn't touched a piano in years. There was a time when music was everything to her. It used to be her dream, her escape, her entire identity. But life had changed faster than she could keep up with. A tragedy in her family, financial struggles, and responsibilities she couldn't run from had forced her to give up the one thing she loved most. She remembered sitting in a small music room years ago, practicing for hours until her fingers ached. She remembered the warm voice of her mentor encouraging her, saying things like, "Your music has a heartbeat, don't lose it." But life had taken her in another direction, and the piano had become a painful reminder. She took a deep breath. The cafe felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in gently. The whispering around her made her hands tremble even more. She wondered if she would make a mistake. She wondered if the old piano would betray her with broken notes. She wondered if she was making a fool of herself. Her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it over the murmurs. She wanted to run away, but another memory came to her. Her mentor's last advice before she stopped playing: don't play for the world. Play for yourself. That's when the music is real. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She didn't know how much she could remember. She didn't know if she could still play. She didn't know if her hands would cooperate. But she closed her eyes for a moment, shut out the crowd, and searched inside herself for the faint spark she once had. The cafe stayed still. Waiting, she opened her eyes slowly, and for the first time that day, she stopped thinking about what people expected from her. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing it to prove anything. She was doing it because something deep inside her wanted to breathe again. She pressed the first chord. It wasn't perfect. The piano was old, the sound uneven. But the moment the note filled the room, the chatter stopped completely. Her fingers moved to the next keys, unsure but steady. She didn't play quickly. She played gently, letting her hands remember the music on their own. A strange calm washed over her. The fear didn't disappear, but it softened. The cafe was no longer a room full of staring faces. It was just a place with a piano. And she was a girl trying to reconnect with a forgotten part of herself. And although she didn't know it yet, this moment, this forced performance, this unplanned return to music was about to change everything for her, and for everyone. Watch. When her fingers touched the keys, it was as if time slowed down. She wasn't sure what she was doing at first. Her mind felt foggy, her hands stiff, and she could still hear the faint giggles from a few tables behind her. But the moment she played the first few notes, the sound stirred something inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't pride, it was simply recognition. Like meeting an old friend after a long time apart. She let her hands settle on the piano, trying to block out the world around her. She tried to breathe normally, but memories kept rising like waves she couldn't control. She remembered the small one-room apartment she used to live in with her family. The piano they had wasn't even theirs. They borrowed it from a neighbor who couldn't keep it anymore. It was scratched and old, but to her, it had been the most magical thing in the world. Back then, she would sit on a wobbly stool, practicing for hours while the rest of her family talked in the background. Her younger sibling would sometimes fall asleep smiling as she played a soft tune late at night. Those were moments full of warmth, even if life was difficult. Her family didn't have much, but they had each other, and music was the one thing that made their little apartment feel like a whole world of its own. As she played the next note in the cafe, the memory grew sharper. She could almost smell the faint scent of the old books her mother kept near the piano. She could hear the gentle humming her father used to do when she practiced, as if he was trying to match her rhythm. And most of all, she remembered her mentor, the older man who lived a few streets away and taught children music in his living room. He didn't charge her much, and sometimes not at all, because he said she played with feeling. That was the phrase he always used. "You play with feeling," he would say, tapping lightly on her shoulder with his soft, wrinkled hand. That is something many can't learn. But everything changed when her mentor passed away. It happened so suddenly that she didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. After that, life shifted in a way she wasn't prepared for. Her father fell ill, bills started piling up, and the piano had to be returned because the family needed space for medical equipment. The sound of keys, once her comfort, slowly became something painful. It reminded her of what she lost: family stability, her mentor, her dream. She stopped playing altogether. She thought she had buried that part of her life forever. That was why she never talked about music at the cafe. She didn't want to explain the story. She didn't want anyone to ask. She didn't want to reopen those wounds. But sitting at the cafe piano now, With all those memories pressing against her heart, she felt a strange mix of pain and peace. It was painful to remember, but peaceful to feel something she thought she had lost forever. She wasn't playing confidently yet. Her hands still trembled, her thoughts still raced with worry. But something was changing inside hers, something small, but real. The hum of the cafe had quietened without her noticing. Even the group of students who had pressured her earlier were now sitting straight, their laughter long gone. No one expected this moment to become serious, but it had. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't look up. She focused on the piano. She didn't play a full song. She started with simple patterns, slow notes, gentle melodies she remembered from childhood. The piano wasn't perfect, some keys stuck. Some sounded flat, but she made it work, just as she used to with her old borrowed piano. She played with careful hands, letting each note settle in the air before moving on while she played. She remembered something else, something she hadn't thought about in a long time. It was the day her mentor told her she had a chance to audition for a small music program. She had been so excited that she couldn't sleep the night before. She had practiced the same piece over and over until her fingers felt numb. She believed that maybe, just maybe, her life could change through music. But on the morning of the audition, her family got news that turned everything upside down. Her father's health had taken a sharp turn, and she had no choice but to let go of the audition and the dream that came with it. She never got another opportunity. Instead, she started working to support her family. Music faded into the background like a forgotten chapter in a book she no longer opened. As those memories rushed back, her eyes burned slightly, but she didn't stop playing. She wasn't playing for the audience now. She wasn't playing because someone pushed her into the spotlight. She was playing for the girl she used to be, the girl who believed in dreams, who practiced on a borrowed piano, who thought music could change everything. Her breathing steadied, and her fingers became smoother. The notes flowed more naturally. She didn't know what the audience heard, but she knew what she felt, an old warmth she thought she had lost forever. In the cafe, people continued watching. Some customers leaned forward. A mother stopped feeding her small child just to listen. A man who had been staring at his phone earlier now lifted his head, surprised by the gentle melody filling the air. Even the cafe manager, who usually stayed in the back office, peeked out when he heard the piano. Her coworker, the one who had pressured her earlier, didn't laugh anymore. He looked confused, almost stunned. He had only wanted to tease her in front of the students, to make them laugh and impress them. He had never imagined that the quiet girl who barely spoke could play even a single note, let alone something so emotional. The girl kept her eyes on the keys, letting her hands lead her. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate anymore. The cafe around her faded further into the background. She could almost imagine that she was alone in a quiet room, just her and the piano. But as the melody grew, another memory surfaced, one she had avoided for years. She remembered the night she promised herself she would never play again. It was after her mentor's funeral. She had gone home, sat on her bed, and whispered to herself that music hurt too much. She felt guilty for even wanting to play when her family was struggling so much. She believed the dream was selfish, unrealistic, and unnecessary. She had walked away from it, even though it broke her heart thinking about that moment now. She realized something she hadn't understood back then. Music wasn't the problem. Losing it was. Her hands slowed for a moment as she processed that realization. But she didn't stop. She kept going, letting the music speak for her. She didn't need words. She didn't need explanations. The piano understood her in a way people never had. Inside the cafe, the silence continued. Even the sound of cups clinking seemed softer somehow, as if everything in the room was holding its breath. As she played the final soft notes of the melody she had carried in her memory for years, her hands rested gently on the keys. She took a deep breath, one that felt shaky but honest. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what people thought. She didn't know if she had done well or poorly. She only knew that something inside her had shifted, something subtle but important. She lifted her hand slowly, letting the last note fade. The cafe was still silent. To silent, her heart beat loudly in her chest. She knew she wasn't done playing yet, not in life, not in her journey, not in this strange moment. Something had begun here, something she didn't fully understand yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a forced performance. In a cafe, this was the beginning of her finding her way back to a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. The cafe felt strangely quiet after she played those first gentle notes, almost as if the whole room had been waiting for her without even realizing it. She could still feel eyes on her, curious, careful, almost respectful now, but she didn't lift her head. She kept her focus on the piano, letting her hands settle again. Her fingers still trembled a little, but the fear that had controlled her earlier had softened. Something inside her had opened, and she wasn't ready to close it yet. She took another breath and let her fingers move across the keys again. This time, the melody grew fuller, richer, more confident. She didn't plan what she was playing. She didn't follow a sheet or a lesson. She simply allowed her hands to wander through memories of music she once knew by heart. A few notes came out rough, a few a little off-key, but most of them blended beautifully, filling the cafe like a soft breeze. The students who had pressured her earlier leaned forward in their seats. They weren't laughing now. One of them gently nudged another, whispering something like, "She's really good." But even that whisper was barely heard in the stillness of the room. They looked ashamed of how they had pushed her, though she could not see their faces because she was still looking down at her co-worker, who had started the whole mess just to entertain people, lowered his head and walked slowly toward the counter, unsure of what to say or do. He hadn't expected this. He thought she would play a few clumsy notes, and everyone would laugh lightly and move on. He had never imagined she would play with such emotion that it could silence an entire room. But she wasn't thinking about any of them. In her mind, she wasn't in the cafe anymore. She was somewhere far away back in her old apartment, sitting on that wobbly stool, trying to master a piece her mentor had told her she wasn't ready for yet. She remembered how she would get frustrated when she missed the same note again and again, and how her mentor would smile and say, "Slow down, feel the music, let it guide your hands." Her hands now did exactly that. She played louder this time, the notes rolling like small waves, steady and full of depth. She felt something rise inside her, a mixture of nostalgia, sadness, and a strange kind of freedom. The cafe around her seemed to fade until all she heard was the piano, and all she felt was the music shaping itself through her fingers. Some customers began recording her quietly with their phones, but they did it respectfully, without flash or loud comments. They knew they were witnessing something rare. Even strangers could tell that this moment was not just a random performance. It was something personal, something emotional, something almost fragile. It felt like watching someone rediscover a piece of themselves they had been forced to hide. A mother who had been feeding her little child earlier was now holding the child close, rocking gently while listening. The child's eyes were wide, staring at the piano as if the music itself was a story being told. An elderly man who came to the cafe every afternoon for tea sat perfectly still, his cup untouched, his eyes glistening slightly. The cafe manager stepped out from behind the counter with a look of disbelief. He had always wondered why the quiet girl seemed to pause near the piano every morning, touching it gently as if greeting an old friend. Now he finally understood that, as she continued playing, the melody shifted again. It became softer this time, almost like a whisper. Her fingers slowed, her wrists relaxing with each movement. She wasn't performing for an audience. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply expressing something she had kept locked inside for too long. She thought about the nights after her mentor passed away, how she would sit in her room and stare at her empty hands, feeling like they had lost their purpose. She remembered the days spent working, carrying boxes, serving tables, standing behind counters each day, pulling her farther and farther away from the life she once dreamed of. She thought about how she had convinced herself that music belonged to another version of her, a version that didn't exist anymore. She had buried that dream so deeply that she almost forgot it ever belonged to her. But now, sitting at the cafe piano, she realized something important. The dream had never left her. It had simply waited, quietly, patiently, until she was ready to face it again. She pressed the next notes with more emotion, letting the music reflect everything she had felt: loss, hope, fear, longing. Her hands moved gracefully, each note flowing like a story written without words. The melody grew stronger, fuller, and then softer again, like the rise and fall of a heartbeat. People in the cafe weren't just listening, they were feeling. They didn't know her story, but they could sense something deep behind her playing. Music has a way of revealing emotions even when words can't, and she, without meaning to, was pouring her heart into every key she touched. A young man near the window leaned back, eyes closed, as if the music reminded him of something from his own life. A couple who had been busy taking pictures of their food put their phones down and held hands instead, moving gently to the rhythm. Even the barista, who was known for being impatient with customers, slowed down, watching her with softened eyes. She didn't notice any of them. She was lost in the movement of her fingers, in the sound of the piano, in the warmth rising in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive, not just living from one day to the next, but truly alive. As the melody shifted once more, Her breathing changed. She felt a small ache inside her chest, the kind you feel when you remember something beautiful that you cannot return to. She knew she couldn't go back to her old life or her old dream exactly as it was. Too much had changed. She had changed, but she also knew something else now. Maybe she didn't need to go back. Maybe she could create something new, something that fit the person she had become. She played a soft sequence of notes, delicate like falling petals. The sound was almost fragile, and yet it was strong enough to quiet even the loudest hearts in the room. She let her fingers rest on the last note for a moment before letting it fade naturally. Silence followed, not awkward, not empty, but full. A deep, heavy silence that felt like a shared breath held by everyone. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her palms felt warm. A tiny tremble ran through her fingers. She finally looked up, something she had avoided since the moment she began playing. And what she saw stunned her. People were staring at her with wide eyes, soft expressions, and gentle faces. No one looked amused. No one looked annoyed. No one looked like they had expected any of this. Instead, they looked moved, truly moved. The entire cafe felt different now, as if the walls themselves had heard her story through the music. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet was overwhelming, but not in a frightening way. It was the kind of silence that forms when people feel something they cannot describe. Then suddenly someone began clapping, slow, steady, genuine. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire cafe erupted into applause. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but warm, respectful, deeply appreciative. She didn't know what to do. She had never been applauded before, not like this. Not by so many people. Not for simply being herself. Her eyes filled slightly, but she blinked quickly, holding the emotion inside. She gave a small, hesitant nod, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She had sat down expecting humiliation, but instead, she had given the room a moment no one expected. She had turned embarrassment into art without meaning to, without planning it. She had reminded everyone, including herself, that some talents never truly disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to rise again. The applause felt unreal to her. It washed over her like a warm wave, filling the cafe with a kind of energy she had never experienced before. She sat there frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do. She had stepped toward the piano, expecting the worst moment of her day, maybe even the worst moment of her whole life. She thought she would embarrass herself, get laughed at, and go home wishing she had never come to work. But instead, people clapped, not politely, not because they felt sorry for her, but because they had truly felt something from what she played. She could see it in their eyes, the softness, the surprise, the kind of admiration you don't fake. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She stood up slowly, her knees still trembling, and gave a small nod. She didn't know how to smile at everyone at once, so she simply looked down and held the edge of the piano lightly, grounding herself. The applause lasted longer than she expected. Even after it quieted, people still looked at her with kindness. A few whispered to each other, but not in a rude way, more like they were talking about something beautiful they had just witnessed. As she stepped back from the piano, her co-worker, the one who had pushed her into playing, stood near the counter, staring at her with wide eyes. He didn't joke. He didn't smirk. Instead, he looked embarrassed, almost guilty. When she walked past him toward the kitchen door, he tried to speak. "I didn't know," he said softly. She didn't know what to say back, so she simply nodded and continued walking. She wasn't angry at him. He hadn't meant to be cruel. He just didn't think about how it would make her feel. But she wasn't thinking about him now. Her mind was too full, too overwhelmed, too tangled in everything that had just happened. She stepped into the back room and leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself. Her hands still tingled from playing. She whispered to herself, "What just happened?" But there was no answer, only the faint echo of applause still ringing in her ears. After a minute, she took a deep breath and stepped back out. She expected everything to go back to normal. She thought people would have already turned back to their drinks, their food, their conversations. But the moment she walked out, several customers turned toward her with excited, grateful expressions. One woman approached her first. She was holding a small notebook and looked like someone who loved art in all forms. "That was beautiful," she said. "You play straight from the heart. Thank you for that moment." Another person, an older man with gentle eyes, smiled warmly. "My wife used to play like that. Listening to you reminded me of her. You brought back a memory I thought I had forgotten. Thank you." She didn't know how to respond to such sincere words. She felt shy, overwhelmed, but also strangely proud. She bowed her head slightly in appreciation. Then someone else stepped forward, a man who had been sitting near the window, quietly observing. He looked different from the others, not because of his clothes, but because of the calm, thoughtful presence he carried. He introduced himself as someone who taught music at a local community center. "I don't want to be pushy," he said gently, "but I recognize a gift when I hear one. You have something rare. Have you ever considered returning to music, maybe taking lessons again, or performing somewhere?" She froze for a moment. His words touched a part of her she had tried to bury. Returning to music, performing, it sounded impossible, but also like a door opening where she never expected one. "I used to play," she admitted softly. "A long time ago, I could tell," he said with a smile. "There's experience in your hands. And emotion, too. If you ever want guidance or opportunities, I'd be happy to help." She thanked him, but her voice cracked slightly. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because no one had spoken to her like that in years. No one had recognized something valuable in her, something beyond her quiet nature or her daily work in the cafe. After the teacher left his contact card on the counter, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt the same anymore. People still looked at her, but now with admiration. A few nodded kindly as she walked past. Some whispered, "That's her," as if she had done something extraordinary. Her coworker approached her again, this time more seriously. "I'm really sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have pushed you like that." She paused and looked at him. This time she wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't shaking. She felt calm. "It's okay," she said softly. "You didn't know?" He nodded, relieved but still embarrassed. "You were incredible," he added. "I think everyone here learned something today, including me." She gave a small smile, then went back to work, wiping tables, pouring drinks, doing the tasks she always did. But everything felt different now. The day wasn't ordinary anymore. It wasn't routine. She felt lighter, almost as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. After her shift ended, she walked outside. The sky had turned golden with the sunset, and the air felt soft against her skin. She stood there for a moment, letting the quiet world outside settle into her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of remembering her past. She didn't feel the ache of losing her dreams as sharply. Instead, she felt something warm and hopeful inside her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was much younger. She walked home slowly, her steps gentle but sure. While walking, she thought about everything that had happened. The fear she felt when everyone stared at her, the trembling in her fingers when she touched the piano, the memories of her mentor, the music rising inside her like a forgotten flame. The way the room fell silent, the applause, the kindness of strangers. She realized something important, something simple but powerful. Music hadn't left her. It had stayed with her through every moment of her life, even when she wasn't playing. It was in the way she noticed the piano every morning, in the way she paused near it without thinking, in the way her heart softened whenever she heard someone else play, in the way her fingers still remembered the notes. Even after all these years, music had been waiting for her, waiting for the moment she would be brave enough or desperate enough to touch the keys again. And now, she understood something even deeper. She didn't have to become a famous pianist. She didn't have to go back to her old dreams. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She only needed to let music back into her life. When she reached her building, she paused before going inside. She looked up at the quiet windows, thinking about how different her world felt compared to just a few hours earlier. She whispered to herself, "Maybe I can try again." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a big declaration. It was just a gentle thought, one that felt soft but real. She walked inside with a new sense of hope. She didn't know what the next day would bring. She didn't know if she would contact the music teacher or if she would just practice quietly on her own somewhere. She didn't know if her life would change dramatically or stay mostly the same. But she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the girl who hid from music. She was no longer the girl who believed her dream belonged to the past. She was no longer the girl who thought she had nothing special in her. She had found her voice again, not through words, but through the piano keys. And the moment that was meant to humiliate her had instead opened. A door she thought had been locked forever had turned fear into courage, silence into music, and embarrassment into art. As she closed her eyes that night, she felt peaceful, truly peaceful. Something inside her had awakened again, and she knew that whatever happened next, she would never forget the day she sat at the old cafe piano and discovered that the part of her she thought she lost had been waiting all along to return. It wasn't just a performance, it was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with possibility, hope, and music that belonged only to her.